Thank you. Recognize young member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister responsible for the Office of Health Promotion. On May 9th of this year, the Office of Health Promotion issued a press release entitled "More Help for Smokers to Quit." The lead in the press release stated, and I quote, "Nova Scotians who want to quit smoking have even more support." Yet, Mr. Speaker, we have been informed that the budget for those supports ran out in the Southwest Nova District on August 1st of this year, just 3 months after the Office of Health Promotion made the announcement. Mr. Speaker, this was before the programs hit their peak demand with such events as Addictions Awareness Week or National Non-Smoking Week. So my question for the Minister, Mr. Speaker, how does he expect the Southwest Nova District to help smokers to quit if their budget already went up in smoke in just 3 months?
The Honourable Minister responsible for Health Promotion.
Well, while the member is huffing and puffing over there, Mr. Speaker, I'll try to answer your first question. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, the member raises a good question. Mr. Speaker, cessation aids are an important part, Mr. Speaker, of moving forward to decrease the number of smokers in our province. Mr. Speaker, I'll get a member an update with respect to the Southwest Board, but I can assure the member and all members that if a need is there in one of our regions, Mr. Speaker, for additional dollars for cessation aids, they will get those dollars.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, you know, the Minister's glib answers probably indicate that he never had an addiction as smoking before, and he would have no idea how serious it is in this province or how many people it affects in this province on a daily basis or how many people die in this country from smoking every day, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, I'm almost certain that the district there isn't going to turn away. Addiction workers are creative and supportive of people who need their help. Mr. Speaker, for districts like Southwest Nova, DHA, and likely others who are running that fine line between meeting their budget, it takes more money from other addictions to support quit smoking programs. Mr. Speaker, given that this government is expecting to receive $175 million in cigarette taxes this coming year. So, Mr. Speaker, would the minister admit that it's unacceptable to run out of budget money for quit smoking aids just 3 months into the fiscal year?
The Honourable Minister of Health Promotion.
Mr. Speaker, what it's a reflection of is the good job this government is doing with respect to its tobacco strategy.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay on your final supplementary.
Peter's just happy to keep getting
Mr. Speaker, this is a government that boasted about increased funding for quit smoking aids only for a district to run out of money just 3 months later. In fact, Mr. Speaker, other districts are probably experiencing similar situations that we're unaware of. Mr. Minister, what this government touts as the great document, Your Health Matters, states that providing treatment can help individuals with addictions and their families who can turn their lives around. Mr. Speaker, my final question for the minister then, could the minister please explain how a lack of funding, which is made up by taking monies out of other addiction programs and services, provides a treatment that can turn people's lives around?
The Honourable Minister of Health Promotion.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is that 30% of Nova Scotians were smoking when this government came into play. Mr. Speaker, 22% of Nova Scotians now have that addiction, Mr. Speaker. That's the difference between the job the previous Liberal government was doing when they were here and this government, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question to you is to the Minister of Natural Resources. In my constituency, we have a very popular provincial park at Caribou. It includes a day-use area, a camping area, a sandy beach, and Monroe's Island. Now, this summer, there were some major changes to the park, especially to the day-use portion of the park, all of which occurred without any public consultation. The construction of a new parking lot means several longer trips for families going to the beach, longer hauls to picnic tables, and loss of use by the elderly were often driven down to overlook the water. These so-called improvements have actually proven to be a major loss to many local people. So, Mr. Speaker, my question through you to the Minister, why was there no public consultation with the users of this park, the people that are most affected?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. All of our parks in the province are very important from one end of the province to the other. And Mr. Speaker, we have staff from one end of this province to the other, and they have constant dialogue with the councils and with the residents of the areas, and we work with those residents. And that member, if he had a question, he should have brought it to my attention prior to the work being completed.
The honourable member Pictou West on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, there was absolutely no consultation with members of the public.
Order, please. Order, please. The honourable member Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This time I'm going to address my question to the minister responsible for the Disabled Persons Commission. One of the biggest losers in this reconfiguration at Caribou are the persons with disabilities, some of whom are just not able to navigate from the new parking area to the beach or even to overlook the water. A park planner indicated to me that not everyone's needs could be accommodated, and they would have to find another site. And Mr. Speaker, that is just not acceptable. The Pictou County's Let Abilities Work organization, who represent the disabled in our community, are so concerned about this lack of sensitivity that they've written a letter to the Human Rights Commission. And we do have a Disabled Persons Commission in this province who were never consulted on the issue. So why, Mr. Speaker, are disabled Nova Scotians being denied access to their own provincial park?
The honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I thank the member opposite for bringing up the operations of the Disabled Persons Commission. This is a commission that is in place to be a voice for the people with disabilities in the province. We do have a vision as a government in working with the Disabled Persons Commission that there will be an evolution where greater access will be achieved for all government facilities, and we look forward to continuing to work with them to make that a reality. I thank the member opposite for pointing out the importance of the Disabled Persons Commission.
Pictou West on your final supplementary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the member for not answering my question. But I'll go back again to the Minister of Natural Resources. Mr. Speaker, I've heard from a number of community members who are very dissatisfied with the changes in the day use portion at Caribou Park. 30 years of barrier-free access to the beach, 30 years of accessing picnic areas and the lookout are gone. There was no public consultation, no consideration for people who have used the park for decades, and absolutely no consideration for the disabled. So will the minister hold his department accountable so that the needs of the local community, especially the disabled, can be addressed?
Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And to that member, if I had been aware of this situation, I would have dealt with it a long time ago. Mr. Speaker, this spring, the member from Richmond brought to my attention the importance of Battery Park. Mr. Speaker, this government made a commitment to Richmond that they would upgrade that park in a 3-year plan. Mr. Speaker, that member brought it to my attention. The members of that community brought it to my attention. We dealt with that, and I will deal with this situation, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.
The honourable member Cape Breton South.
Thank you.
Order,
Thank
please.
you very much, Mr.
The honourable member Cape Breton
Mr.
South.
Speaker, today my question is for the office of the Minister of the Office of Economic Development. Mr. Speaker, in question period last week, the Minister stated that the film industry is doing very well. Well, Mr. Speaker, it may be doing very well in provinces like Manitoba and Alberta, but not here in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, production in Nova Scotia is down 18% since 2001, a period when overall production across the country actually grew. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the industry in the province has experienced one of its worst summers since the Nova Scotia film tax credit was established in 1995. Shame. In this same period, Mr. Speaker, that corporation, the Crown Corporation, mandated to help grow the industry, has been neglected. My question for the Minister: if he is truly committed to the film industry in Nova Scotia, why has funding for the Nova Scotia Film Development Corporation either declined or been held flat over the last 5 years?
The honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And to the honourable member's question, certainly the honourable member is aware that funding increased through an increase in the film tax credit, and certainly funding has been constant since I've been minister responsible for the Film Board.
The honourable member Cape Breton South on your first supplementary.
I think the key word there, Mr. Speaker, was constant. He didn't say anything about increasing funding for the Film Development Corporation. The film industry is an attractive career path in Nova Scotia for its young people. It can provide the skills needed to live and work in this province, and as a result affords youth the opportunity to build a skilled career right here at home rather than having to go down the road. Further, Mr. Speaker, the industry helps to build a creative and innovative workforce, something essential to compete in today's economy. With this in mind, my supplementary to the Minister, Mr. Speaker. Will the Minister agree to help keep some of our best and brightest youth in the province by committing to bringing the provincial government's tax credit to a truly competitive level?
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, as the honourable member would fully recognize, it was this government that raised the film tax credit to its current level. Several other jurisdictions have increased that level in the last year, and we will take that into consideration during our budget consultations.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton South on your final supplementary.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, thank you very much, and I want to thank the Minister for reminding me that it was this government that reduced the film tax credit to the point where it destroyed the film stage industry in Cape Breton, which is now a warehouse in Point Edward. That's what this government did in the film tax credit. And also, Mr. Speaker, this government is truly not competitive with other provinces in this country, particularly in some provinces have up to 40% film tax credit. Now, Mr. Speaker, I know that there's a problem between the Department of Finance and the Department of Economic Development regarding the film tax credit and its tax obligations. And, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister is, why has not the Minister succeeded in convincing the Minister of Finance to increase the film tax credit in Nova Scotia to a competitive level, namely 40%, which is being offered in other provinces in this country?
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
The only thing I can remind the honourable minister, this month is October. The budget comes down in March and April. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Transportation. Mr. Speaker, within my urban constituency are two stretches of provincial highway, the Bicentennial Highway that comes down the Fairview Hill to Bears Road, and Northwest Arm Drive between Main Avenue and the Old Sambor Road. The problem I want to raise today is not the roads themselves, but rather the inadequate maintenance of provincial land running alongside the roads. In particular, I would mention the concerns of the residents of Abbott Drive, Elliott Street, and School Avenue. These residents suffer to varying degrees from flooding, graffiti, garbage, unmowed grass, and unrepaired tree damage on provincial land. My question to the Minister, when will the Department of Transportation start taking seriously its responsibility to maintain provincial property alongside the Bicentennial Highway?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Speaker, the Department of Transportation takes very seriously the maintenance not only of roads, but of these areas alongside our highways.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Fairview on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, because this is an urban setting, these provincial roadside properties abut property owned by the Halifax Regional Municipality and sometimes the Halifax Regional Water Commission. Invariably, there is confusion among residents and even among provincial and municipal work crews about what portions of the roadside properties each is responsible for maintaining. The best maintained properties are the ones that the HRM crews maintain by mistake. And the worst maintained properties are the ones where each side is pointing the finger at the other, saying that it's their responsibility. My question to the Minister, what concrete assurances can the Minister give people living near the Bicentennial Highway that provincial property will be maintained by provincial crews with adequate resources to get the job done?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Mr. Speaker, I guess as the honourable member is aware, if he looks out his window at the amount of work that's going on the Bi-High at the present time, just adjacent, I believe, to School Road. Mr. Speaker, that would be a road I would think that any member would be proud to have in his particular constituency.
Halifax Fairview on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister doesn't seem to understand it's not about the road, it's about the property running alongside the road. Mr. Speaker, a couple of weeks ago I looked at one particular area behind Abbott Drive. This is the area where the Bicentennial Highway is on concrete pillars above the residential area. This area is subject to regular winter flooding and the homeowner I visited told me that she wants to stay in the area, but the flooding problem is serious enough and persistent enough that that alone is enough to make her think about moving. So my question to the minister, in order that we can start working towards an effective and permanent solution to the problems experienced by people in my constituency who have the Bicentennial Highway for a neighbour, will the minister tour the affected area with me?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'd always be willing to tour with the honourable member for Halifax Fairview, and certainly I can do that. But, Mr. Speaker, seriously, the concern that the honourable member has with regard to that area is one that is very, very difficult to identify as to whose responsibility it really is to maintain that area. And I'll be pleased to take a trip with the honourable member sometime, but not during the winter.
The honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Natural Resources. He just got up and said that if you write about a park that's closed and got a problem with it, he'll react. Well, I wrote you a year ago about the Porters Lake Provincial Park, and you guaranteed me at that time, in writing, that the park would be repaired.
Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. I ask the honourable member Preston to direct his comments to the chair, please. The honourable member Preston has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the minister at that time promised in writing that that park would be repaired. And to this day, there's been absolutely no work done on that park except being logged. That's the biggest provincial campground in all of Nova Scotia that the province owns. And I want to know when this is going to be repaired to correct the problem with the employment and the problems it's causing local businesses and the loss of business as a result of that park.
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, during Hurricane Juan, we had approximately 30 of our parks was affected by Hurricane Juan. The most devastation was to Porters Lake. Mr. Speaker, we've been dealing with the federal government for the disaster relief. We finally got that approved here within the last couple of weeks. Mr. Speaker, there's a tender going out. I made a commitment to that community. That park will be open next year for the season, and it will be open next year for the season, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Preston, you have about 35 seconds.
The trouble is next year never comes. Next year never comes. And I'll believe it when I see it, and so will the residents of Porters Lake. This park has to be opened, and there's not enough time this year to do the work, and there won't be enough time next spring to get the work done so it'll open in a timely manner. Well, I'll watch you. I want to make sure that happens. Will you guarantee that will happen and be open in the early spring?
George, about 10 seconds.
Mr. Speaker, if that member had so much concern about it, he'd have joined the member from Eastern Passage and went to that park twice with me, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Order, please. Time allotted for question period has expired. The honourable member for Cole Harbour should pass on opposition members' business. The honourable member for Kings West on point of order.
Yes, I would like for the Minister of Education to table in the House tomorrow documentation as to what has been spent of the $5.1 million on the student debt.
Order, please. It's not a point of order. The only documents required to be tabled are ones that a member actually refers to or reads from during the House, not one they may mention of or refer to. It was. The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Trying it on a daily basis now to see.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Minister of Natural Resources. As often people misname my riding, so I'm glad someone actually identified it when he wasn't actually speaking of my riding. I want to call Bill number 124, Mr. Speaker.
Bill number 124. The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to have an opportunity to rise and speak on Bill 124, which is an act to amend the Health Services and Insurance Act in Nova Scotia. And Mr. Speaker, if I may, I'll just read the operative clause in this act. It's a very short little act. It says that no person shall publicly advertise diagnostic imaging services to be provided by a public business. So essentially, Mr. Speaker, this is a bill to prohibit the advertising of private MRI services in the province of Nova Scotia. Now, Mr. Speaker, why did I introduce this bill?
Order, please. Order, please. Young member Halifax Needham has the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, perhaps members of the legislature will recall that back in July of this year, there was a householder went out from the private MRI clinic, and I'd be happy at the end of my discussion of Bill 124 to table a copy of that householder that went out in flyers and went out in newspapers to households across the province. I'm not sure how many of these householders were actually circulated, but I understand it was certainly in excess of 100,000 households, which is quite a large number, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, the householder raised a number of concerns. I think is probably an understatement in terms of the content of this particular piece of advertising for the private MRI. For example, Mr. Speaker, in the testimonials that constituted the back page of the householder, there was a statement unattributed to any individual that said, "It isn't supposed to happen. Emergency cases are supposed to have priority in the public health system, but things happen, and priority cases slip through the cracks. MRIs are delayed and people die." Now, Mr. Speaker, this is surely a piece of fear-mongering that is unacceptable in relation to the legitimate fears and concerns that people have about whether or not the public health care system is going to be there to meet their needs in their time of need, or in the time of need of their family members. And Mr. Speaker, yes, there may be things that happen in cases of emergency. We know there have been very long wait lists in emergency departments and what have you. But Mr. Speaker, I don't think in all fairness it can be said that emergency cases are not given priority in the public health care system. Emergency cases, in fact, are given priority in the public health care system. Emergency cases, in fact, are given priority in terms of having access to MRIs in our system, and priority cases are given priority through the triage system. And I think this is sort of disgraceful as a piece of advertising, and it is what caused me to think about whether or not we should permit advertising of this nature for private MRI services. Mr. Speaker, on the front page of this piece of advertisement, it says, "Your health care should be a personal choice," as if we were talking about a facial or a haircut. And Mr. Speaker, we're certainly not talking about something that is, so, sort of basic and unnecessary in some ways as making a choice about where you get your manicure. We're talking about primary health care services and critical health care services. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to talk a bit about why people in this legislature, members of this legislature, should consider supporting this particular piece of legislation. Mr. Speaker, I think we're all aware of the proliferation of public services that have, or private services that have occurred in our province, and in some ways, some of these services have sprung up because the public system has failed to keep up with the need and the demand of the public. But in other ways, some of the private services have really grown in a way that contributes to an undermining of our public health care system. And this is certainly something that we're concerned about in the NDP. Mr. Speaker, we'll all know that diagnostic services have historically been provided as part of the insured package of healthcare services that are available to people through the public healthcare system when you go to a hospital. And we all know that the wait times for many public diagnostic services in hospitals have grown. And partly this is because of outdated equipment or the fact that we haven't had enough of the technology available in the areas where we most needed it, and also because there was a limiting of the number of trained staff that were available, or the budgets that DHAs, for example, had to work with to put on that additional shift. But Mr. Speaker, I think that one of the things that we have seen, and we will credit the government with doing in this province, has been doing the work that has eliminated some of the wait times, particularly for diagnostic services with respect to MRIs. I can remember 2 years ago when the wait lists were quite a bit longer than what is the sort of industry standard or the national standard in the country to get an MRI over at the QE2, for example. And we know that we've had an additional shift put on. I know that we're now using the MRI that's at the Children's Hospital to take some of the pressure off the wait times in the Capital District. And there's been the addition of an MRI in Cape Breton. And I think all of these initiatives have been positive initiatives, and they contribute to a reduction in wait times for diagnostic services. And so I would hope, Mr. Speaker, that members of this legislature would say to their constituents today that in the case where your family physician and treating specialists identify that you have an emergency need for an MRI and have priority on the list, you will get access in a timely fashion in our public health care system, and you will not have to face the choice of trying to decide where you can come up with $750 or so to go to the private MRI clinic. Mr. Speaker, there are numerous unattributed testimonials in this advertisement that went out, and many of them engender a sense of fear that the public system will let people down at their time of need. And Mr. Speaker, I think that's a really unfortunate message, and it's a message that's being put forward merely to exploit the fears that people have that they won't get health care in a timely fashion, and will create, a greater market for this private clinic. Mr. Speaker, I've watched with interest the election in the province of Ontario, for example, Mr. Speaker, where the Liberal Party ran on a platform of really strengthening public sector services in that province. They, Premier McGuinty, before he became Premier in that election campaign, said that he was going to restore the services that had been so badly eroded in the province of Ontario under the former Harris and Eves government. And one of the commitments he made, in fact, was to expand the access to MRI diagnostic services that had been seriously undermined in that province through the establishment of numerous private MRIs. Recently, in the last few months, he has followed through on many of those commitments that he made. I believe in the first budget of the McGuinty government in the province of Ontario, in fact, there was money in the budget set aside to expand the public provision of MRI diagnostic services. And in fact, there is some negotiation going on with those private providers so that they will be brought into the public system. And Mr. Speaker, I think that that's an initiative that has also been a feature of what's happened in the province of Quebec. So these are interesting developments, I think, that we have to keep ourselves apprised of here in Nova Scotia. There's a lot of debate about the role of private delivery in our healthcare system, but the thing that we really need to remember is that there is very little evidence that private delivery of healthcare, in fact, results in cost savings. Romano asked when he went across the country for evidence. Show me the evidence. And none of that evidence was forthcoming. The other thing that we know, Mr. Speaker, is that there is only, no matter what you have in terms of the private delivery of healthcare service, there's still only one doctor, and the doctors are in the public healthcare system. The private MRI system has the very grave potential of creating queue jumping, and this is something that is of concern right across the country. Radiologists, in fact, themselves have urged a real limit on private MRI clinics across the country. They're very concerned about the unchecked privatization of these clinics and what the implication is for the long-term stability of healthcare. I think we have to look ahead. We have to realize that MRIs, for example, they are not the most sophisticated diagnostic tool that's currently available. That there is a new kid on the block, the PET technology, that is extraordinarily expensive. There's a private PET clinic in Vancouver that charges $2,500 for a PET diagnostic scan. Now, Mr. Speaker, we have to get a grip and get a handle on the provision of healthcare services, on the extending of these services to everybody, regardless of their ability to pay, which is the whole fundamental principle on which our healthcare system is established, and it is the fundamental principle on which Canadians from coast to coast to coast repeatedly in polls and in elections express what their values and what their desires and what their expectations of their government are with respect to these services. So, Mr. Speaker, I think that we need to take a much more rigorous line. Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I welcome the opportunity to comment on the bill which has been presented to the House this afternoon with respect to the issue of advertising the services of a privately owned and operated diagnostic imaging device. And one of the observations, Mr. Speaker, that I would make with respect to this particular issue is I found it to be extremely interesting that the operators of this facility indeed would find it necessary to come forward with the advertising they have and the nature of that advertising. And I share the honourable member's concern with respect to some of the claims that were made within that advertising. But when I consider the issue of the advertising itself, the question that it raises in my mind is whether or not they were entirely satisfied with the response that they have received to the provision of this service within the province of Nova Scotia. And Mr. Speaker, one of the things, of course, that happens and is happening at the same time that the private operators of this facility made their decision to come forward is that government, of course, was also investing dollars, very significant dollars, in the provision of this same service here in the Capital District and in Cape Breton. And we are committed, of course, Mr. Speaker, to not only providing that service here, but we are very actively involved in the process of evaluating the needs for this service right across the province. And I expect within the month, Mr. Speaker, to have a comprehensive report in my hands relative to the service that is needed. So when I consider the issue of the advertising, the thought that goes through my mind is whether or not we should be so concerned about the advertising, and I am concerned about the nature of the advertising, but the advertising itself, or whether or not it is reflective of the fact that we are in fact addressing the wait time issue with respect to the provision of diagnostic services. And I'll have a bit more to say about wait times in general as I proceed in my remarks. But that is an observation that I share with the House with respect to the need for advertising for private MRI services that perhaps we are doing even better than we had hoped in terms of providing this service, because the private operators felt the need to get out and try and compete with the public facility. Now, Mr. Speaker, as I indicated, we are very much involved in analyzing our future needs, and as I indicated to the House, we will have a report before us in the very near future relative to those needs. And that report is examining in depth the site location of future facilities, the number of facilities that would be required, and the nature of those facilities, i.e. whether they be fixed facilities or whether they be whether we utilize the capacity to have mobile services within this province. So I'm looking forward to that report when it comes forward. But as we move forward, Mr. Speaker, in the provision of services within this province, I believe that the correct action for us to take is to strengthen the service that is provided by the government of the province, and by strengthening that service, then we can ensure that the issue brought forward by the honourable member is one that would be minimized in this province as we move forward and we move into the future. The public health system in this province, Mr. Speaker, obviously is a service that has its challenges. There's no doubt about that. Anybody that would spend time in question period in the legislature would understand that there are challenges with that, because the question period tends to reflect some of those challenges. But, Mr. Speaker, we have in fact made great progress. We have made great progress because as a government over the period of the past 5 years, we have invested over $500 million in health care, additional incremental spending in health care over the period of the past 5 years. And Mr. Speaker, in last year alone, we increased our budget by $230 million. Mr. Speaker, that is a very significant commitment to health care in Nova Scotia. We have, Mr. Speaker, of course, concluded an agreement with the Government of Canada that will see additional dollars come to this province. 15 million of those additional dollars will be dollars that will be committed to increasing our diagnostic capacity through equipment and medical equipment that would be made available for this province to assist us in the delivery of health care, and in particular in the area of diagnostic services, which are so important. And indeed, the honourable member in her remarks correctly pointed out the fact that MRIs are no longer the forefront of medical services, that there are and there will continue to be, as we move forward, new and better devices that can be used in the diagnosis of illnesses for the people in Canada. And of course, one of the challenges that we have is to ensure that we are aware of where these facilities are, and that the practitioners of healthcare in the province are aware of where these facilities are and when they might be used as a substitute and perhaps used more effectively than some of the equipment we have within our province. So, Mr. Speaker, as we consider this particular bill, I want to say that I believe the emphasis needs to be on expanding the level of our service to our citizens, and expanding that service in such a way that those who would seek to invest in the private sector would look at the job that we are doing and say, there isn't really a market for us to be able to move into the private sector. And I believe that that's the challenge that faces us within the Department of Health. Part of that challenge, of course, is for us to achieve success in the longer term with the efforts of the Office of Health Promotion, because the more that we can have our citizens begin to live healthier lifestyles, then the less demand that there will be for medical services and for the treatment of illnesses. So that has got to be a major priority and continue to be, and that's why we have committed to adding, to doubling the budget of the Office of Health Promotion over the period of the next, well, it was a 4-year commitment, and we're well on the way to achieving that particular commitment. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, I think we saw evidence today in one of the questions that was brought forward is that we are perhaps more successful in achieving some of our objectives with respect to health promotion than we had even thought. And as a result of that success, then we need to revamp the money that we commit to certain activities, such as the cessation of smoking, and consider even more money in those areas. But that, Mr. Speaker, is a good problem. That's a positive problem to have when the take-up on the programs that you bring forward is higher than than it had been anticipated, and indeed the success that is being achieved, the reduction of smokers from 30% of the population down to 22% of the population, and every indication that that line will continue in a downward direction is a tremendous measure of success relative to the activities in health promotion. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to say to all members of the House that our emphasis is going to be to ensure that we provide a level of health care in this province that will discourage any people who would be involved or might seek to invest money in the area of private investment for the delivery of health care. We are committed to the tenets of the Canada Health Act. We are committed to ensuring that Nova Scotia receives the very best in healthcare service, Mr. Speaker. And as I have indicated, the principles of the Health Act, the comprehensiveness, universality, portability, access based on need, and public administration. Those are the principles to which we are committed. And, Mr. Speaker, if we continue to make the progress that we have made in recent years, we will discourage further investment by private enterprise, and this as an issue will not persist within this province. And back to my original point, that indeed part of the dilemma that appears to be coming forward on the part of those who have invested in the private MRI clinic is one where they are perhaps not getting the response to their service that they had hoped. They found it necessary to go ahead and invest more money, and as a result of that, they invest money in advertising to try and increase the demand for their service. And we have, Mr. Speaker, decreased the demand for that service by meeting targets. The MRI in Capital Health has come down to the target of 42 days, Mr. Speaker. And the average wait time has come down by more than 100 days over the past 13 months. And that, sir, represents real progress. And as a result of that progress, Mr. Speaker, many who would consider investing in the private sector with respect to health care would be discouraged, because it is our intention, working with the people of this province, to ensure that the public health care delivery system we have in place is second to none in this country, and is one which will do the job that needs to be done to look after the health care needs of Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, there's a couple of other points I wanted to make. Perhaps you can give me some guidance as to my time frame. 1 minute. Well, I'm not going to make too many points with 1 minute, Mr. Speaker, but I will say that that we do have a wait time monitoring project steering committee. It was established in 2003 in this province. We are investing $456,000 to assist that committee to address their priorities. And their priorities are reducing wait times in our province, Mr. Speaker, and the area of priorities will result in Nova Scotians receiving much better service than they currently do, because we are continue to make real progress relative to the provision of health care. And Mr. Speaker, orthopedics is one of the areas where there's a priority, and that, of course, is related to the diagnostic services provided. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Time has expired. I recognize the honourable member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, pleasure to rise and speak on Bill number 124, the Health Services and Insurance Act, which is a bill that prohibits the public advertising by public businesses of diagnostic imaging. Mr. Speaker, you know, with this bill it becomes more and more apparent that the official opposition has run out of any new ideas to come forward with in this legislature. And they seem to be rather stuck in the past, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, our party is committed to a single-payer access to medical services for all Nova Scotians. And I would agree that it would be preferable if this clinic was not desired by some Nova Scotians. I'll agree. But the fact remains the services are being asked for. Unfortunately, it's a symptom of a public system that is failing to address their needs in the first place. Despite the best effort of healthcare professionals, government has failed to properly administer their funds. And, Mr. Speaker, this is a classic symptom of mismanagement. Now, Mr. Speaker, having said that, I think this bill could probably be more aptly titled the Head in the Sand Act, Mr. Speaker. It is the New Democratic Party, Mr. Speaker, saying that we know the clinic exists, but please don't tell anybody about it. This bill accomplished nothing other than to highlight what the NDP want to legislate, which is everything, including free speech, Mr. Speaker. Advertising, whether you like it or not, advertising, whether you're a member of the NDP or not, Mr. Speaker, advertising is free speech. It is a form of free speech. So where does it stop? I'll get to that. Where does it stop? What else is it that the NDP wants to ban, Mr. Speaker? What else?
Order. The honourable member for Glace Bay has the floor.
Mr. Speaker,
Order.
Mr. Speaker, there are examples.
Order. Honourable member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, there are examples, of course, where advertising is restricted and even banned. Let me give you a prime example. Tobacco advertising. Tobacco advertising is not tolerated by society. Smoking is bad for your health. That's plain and simple. There's little evidence, Mr. Speaker, that this clinic in itself is bad for your health. There's absolutely no evidence of that. It's a symptom of a healthcare system that needs fixing, Mr. Speaker. There's a lot of evidence of that, but to ban advertising does not make it go away. The reality is that most Nova Scotians want the health care they deserve in a timely fashion. Mr. Speaker, if you are sick, you are not concerned how the service is delivered as long as you get the treatment, as long as it's done under a single-payer government plan. Mr. Speaker, as we have stated, the establishment of diagnostic clinics are a symptom of a system that simply needs fixing. So why do Nova Scotians feel they need to go to a private clinic, Mr. Speaker? Well, I would suggest it's because they have no assurance that the system is working. Rather than penalize private companies, perhaps the government should be forced to let people know that the system is working. Now, Mr. Speaker, it's perfectly okay for the NDP to publish a partisan brochure with taxpayers' dollars, but they don't want a private company to be able to advertise using their own funds. Make no mistake, Mr. Speaker, make no mistake that the NDP is a party of do as I say, not as I do, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, they have no problem whatsoever wasting taxpayers' dollars on things other than health or education, and the NDP believe that they're entitled to taxpayers' dollars, but they don't seem to believe that taxpayers should have the right to make up their mind where they spend their dollars, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, that would lead us to another place, Mr. Speaker. And I don't mind the jammering, Mr. Speaker. That's not bothering me at all. But it leads me to another place that the NDP, in their role as the so-called official opposition, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you know, it was a great Canadian parliamentarian by the name of Stanley Knowles. Stanley Knowles, as a member of the CCF, a sort of social conscience for the NDP. And Stanley Knowles once said, and I quote, "I submit, therefore, that you do not have full political democracy, let alone the economic as well as political democracy for which my party stands, unless you include, along with the ingredients that are taken for granted, such as universal suffrage, the secret ballot, and majority rule, a full and unquestioned recognition of the rights and functions of the opposition, the government of the day. Only in this way can you protect the rights of minorities. Only in this way can you make sure that the force of public opinion will be brought to bear on the legislative process, Mr. Speaker." Unquote. Well, Mr. Speaker, Stanley Knowles, I don't think, would be very proud of this lot today. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, who's protecting the rights of Nova Scotians and ensuring that their voices are heard? Not the NDP, Mr. Speaker, not the NDP. By failing to provide a proper opposition, this government and this opposition is failing Nova Scotians. Now, Mr. Speaker, you know, we've seen some pretty, what you would call, fluff bills by members of the party. And the government calls a couple of them, and the NDP are very happy. Oh, isn't the government great? And we love the government. Now, this bill is somewhat of an exception, but for the most part, the NDP they don't want to criticize the government. They get a few crumbs from the government, and then they go away, and they leave the job of being the official opposition, the real opposition, to the Liberal Party of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, to the Liberal Party of Nova Scotia. Now, Mr. Speaker, you know, in fairness to the member from Halifax Needham who introduced this bill, I think honestly that she tries to speak up on behalf of Nova Scotians. I really do. Thank you. But, Mr. Speaker, you know, now she's kind of put on the sidelines by an NDP leader who is afraid to offend anyone anymore. You know, he doesn't want to offend anyone. He wants to stay right on that fence, Mr. Speaker, is what he wants to do.
Look out for business. Look out for business.
Members like, for instance, Mr. Speaker, the member for Dartmouth East, they get their little bills called by the government. And the media, you know, sometimes they don't pay much attention to what happens in Opposition Day. But this time, however, Mr. Speaker, let's have the media listen very closely. The government promised to pay for the medical costs of long-term care, but we have yet to see the final product. We don't know what the new system will look like, but the NDP leader gave this government carte blanche to do whatever it wants. The member for Halifax Needham, Mr. Speaker, who was once the champion of seniors in long-term care, has been reduced to introducing one-paragraph bills that ban advertising, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is the same party that said it would be political suicide to oppose a tax cut, even though we knew the government could not afford it. Mr. Speaker, what happened to the NDP who championed the cause of seniors in this province, Mr. Speaker? Basically, Mr. Speaker, what the government has been saying is, NDP, you got your long-term care, and we passed a few of your little bills, so just be quiet and go away, and don't bother us anymore. And you know, Mr. Speaker, the NDP has been as quiet as a mouse since the government said that. And sure, we have some members, Mr. Speaker, who they half-heartedly oppose the government, but for the most part, government has the NDP just where they want them. Just where they want them. Mr. Speaker, I never thought that I'd see the day in this House when the NDP had been co-opted by government, Mr. Speaker. The NDP, the so-called official opposition, propping up a government that fails to fund health care, it fails to fund education, and just in general it fails, Mr. Speaker. In general, it just fails. Mr. Speaker, you know, by supporting last spring's budget, the NDP, as I mentioned, gave the Tories carte blanche to run roughshod over our health and education system. Mr. Speaker, if there's one hospital bed closed, one ER closure, or one senior left out of the new long-term plan program, you have no one else to thank for that except the NDP, Mr. Speaker. Because what they have given government is a blank check to do whatever they want. Now, Mr. Speaker, you know, on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, we have studied minority government. And I can't find, in all the study that we've done of minority governments, I can't find one example, not one example, where the so-called official opposition was in the position of propping up the government. Is that the purpose of a minority government, Mr. Speaker? It is really a groundbreaking concept, Mr. Speaker, when one party decides that their role in minority government will be nothing more than to prop up the minority government side of the House, Mr. Speaker. Groundbreaking, silenced by government, Mr. Speaker. You know, there was a big joke when we first came into this House of Assembly, when I was first elected in 1999, and the government backbenchers would say absolutely nothing, and we used to say, in a joking manner, with all due respect, Mr. Speaker, the silence of the hams. That was the big joke. And we haven't come up with a slogan to replace that yet, but we're working on it for the NDP, Mr. Speaker. It's just that nothing in the NDP rhymes with ham. So we're still working on it. It's very difficult, but we have research staff working on it round the clock, Mr. Speaker, until we finally come up with a replacement for ham on the NDP. Well, basically, the NDP is the same as ham and the government right. Well, it's very confusing, Mr. Speaker, as you can understand by what I'm trying to say. But what has happened is that the NDP, they've actually bought into their own press that they are providing some sort of enlightened progressive opposition in this House, Mr. Speaker, when everyone knows that, in fact, the opposite is true. They are providing, Mr. Speaker, no opposition at all in this House. That's what's happening. And as I said, they are propping up the government, supporting the government at every turn, and every little once in a while, the government throws over a few crumbs and says, here you go, and the NDP says, oh, thank you, kind sir. I'll take those crumbs and we'll prop you up once again in the next vote. Time after time after time after time, Mr. Speaker. They are breaking their back. Mr. Speaker, some more examples have arrived, Mr. Speaker. They are breaking their back to curry favor for a few crumbs in the form of maybe a piece of legislation, or maybe even a road paved here and there, Mr. Speaker. Oh, the shame, Mr. Speaker, the absolute shame that the NDP would be reduced to that kind of I can't even find a term to describe it, Mr. Speaker. Can't even find a term to describe it. Wait now, Mr. Speaker, I have found a term. I have found a term. They've sold out. That's what they've done. They've sold out Nova Scotians for a few pieces of silver, Mr. Speaker.
While there is a bit of theatrical reference there, I would ask the honourable member perhaps if you could rephrase that, withdraw the comment.
And may I add what a fine job you're doing, Mr. Speaker. The NDP, Mr. Speaker, is not an opposition party. What they've been relegated to is the position of a reluctant cheerleader for the government now. That's all they do. Of all the issues facing Nova Scotia today, and this bill is the best that they can do as the official opposition, is this the biggest grievance that the NDP has against this government, Mr. Speaker?
Order, please. The time the opposition member has expired. I recognize the honourable member for Hants East.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I have to say that if the honourable member who just spoke has to say if this bill is the best that they could do, I want to say to the caucus opposite, is that member the best they could do to respond to the... Well, now we know why they're in third place. Mr. Speaker, I don't know what other members thought when they were first elected to the House of Assembly. I know that probably I was a bit naive, I think, in what I thought I might be able to do for my constituents. And I have to say that on lots of days I'm overwhelmed by what it is that my constituents ask of me. I'm surprised when I thought when I first was elected in 1998, I was overwhelmed, I have to say, by the workload, and I thought I would get used to it. And going on for it'll be 7 years in March, and I'm still not used to it. I'm amazed that on occasion, I've noticed twice since I've been elected in '98 that it ramped up a notch, that it seemed to get busier when I thought I should be quite accustomed to the pace. But with that said, Mr. Speaker, I think it's been the notion that I really thought when I got elected that I would grab the world by the tail and give it a shake, and I would make it a better place. I would make it a better place for my constituents. And I know that the usual things that I do on a wide variety of issues, and all members in the House do it, whether it's community services work, whether it's trying to get a pothole fixed, bushes cut along a road, working hard to try to get a better deal for farmers in this province, whatever it might be. I guess sometimes I think you get taken up in the day-to-day obligations that we've taken on in trying to represent our constituents. And I wasn't expecting that when I got elected, Mr. Speaker. And I thought that my presence in this caucus and in this House would get me to, bring me to a point where I could actually significantly influence change in the province and improve the lives of people. And one of the most telling times that I can remember that happened actually was on the issue of the long-term care for seniors, which was an issue that was really taken forward by our leader. And it was a couple of years of hard work, and actually we did accomplish a goal, or we think we have. January 1st is not here, and it's not clear to us exactly how this is going to be spelled out, but that is, for me, is one of the single most issues that I can see that we played a role in to improve the lives of people, but we don't see that every day. And the contradiction, as entertaining as the member from Glace Bay was, the contradiction, I think, of him is that they were a party that last spring had spoke openly against the tax cut and supported our initiative on the long-term care to have the government pick up the health care side of those costs for seniors. And yet, when those two things were offered in the budget, they voted against the budget, except for one member, Mr. Speaker. So I'm not sure if there's a way to be more hypocritical than that, but there may be. But I want to say, Mr. Speaker, that I started to read a little bit just prior to this presentation on the life and political times of Tommy Douglas. And I have to say, Tommy Douglas is a person that I only know from what I see on TV and the little bit that I've read, and certainly by being a New Democrat, that's a name that New Democrats certainly know. And I never had the opportunity to meet him, although I think colleagues of mine had. But I've had a lot of opportunity to get to know the people around me. My wife, my kids, my immediate family. And this bill that we're talking about that would prohibit advertising for diagnostic services, that is the crux of the matter for me, is the idea that publicly funded health care in a public system is what we should support because of the people who are close to us. I mean, long ago, well, in the 60s, we turned our back on a system that would run people into poverty to pay for health care. Now, the Americans haven't done that yet. The American system, which is the system we left behind, should be a window into a world we don't want to go. I have friends in South Dakota, They're getting to be elderly. The gentleman had a knee replacement roughly a year ago. I talked to him, the last time I talked to him was just before Christmas last year. And he said to me, "John, I'm starting to worry. My health insurance is $700 a month." Now, I think my constituency assistant thinks of me as a conspiracy theorist, because I don't believe that the Conservatives and Liberals in this country really support public health care. I don't believe it. Now, and the reason I don't believe it, there's a couple. One is, I think if you underfund this system, underfund it badly enough, the Canadians will say, "I don't care how I get it, I'll pay for it." And when we open that door, there will be no going back. And what has allowed to happen in this country is the continual underfunding of health care that we can afford. And that's a statement that is not made often enough. We can afford to fund this system to give people timely, appropriate health care. Now, I like the Minister of Health. I think the Minister of Health is a nice guy. But when he says that they're going to discourage the private sector, that's not good enough. I don't want a system that we're going to discourage the private sector. I want a message to the private sector that says, "We're not allowing you here." Now, this bill doesn't do that. But this bill is a wedge, at least. And it's a wedge that's an appropriate wedge that my colleague is trying to bring to this House, that at least, because she knows that a bill to stop the spread of MRIs is not going to pass by this government. And that's another telling sign of this government agenda of what it's willing to allow. But at least if you could prevent them from advertising, then you would ensure that they're not going to proliferate. Now, the other reason I think that this government is not concerned about this issue of privatization, and the member from Glace Bay to rail about freedom of speech and advertising, give me a break. That's not the issue. The issue is the privatization of health care. That's the issue. Advertising is something the private sector does. Now, the reason I believe that the government is not interested in protecting public health care in this country, in this province, is because an MRI costs about $1.2, $1.4 million. And the $155 tax rebate that the government gave out last year cost about $70 million. Now, if the government was really interested, now that would be, what would that give us? 50 MRIs? So we wouldn't need 50, for sure. But we had the money to fund all the necessary MRIs in this province under a publicly funded system, and we didn't do that, or the government didn't do that. And they could have done it. And they showed that they had the dollars to do that, Mr. Speaker, and chose not to do it. And by the way, that $155 has been grabbed back in spades. In other words, probably anybody is the least they're paying in extra income tax this year is more than the $155, but the least they'd be paying would be $155. So the government has grabbed that all back. It's the only time I've ever seen anybody take back a bribe, but I guess it's possible. Well, the members opposite say I don't mean that. Well, I'm glad this is on the record, because they can check the wording. Mr. Speaker, there's another reason I think that the government has no problem with this, and actually what worries me is that the Liberals have no problem with this. The member from Glace Bay talked about people wanting to pay for these services, so he seems to think that that's quite all right. And that helps clinch my notion that Liberals and Tories certainly are willing to go down the road of underfunding health care, number one, and number two, allowing for a private system. But the Minister of Transportation certainly has been trying to put forward a model in the Department of Transportation for the rural impact mitigation money, and which is to turn as much money, taxpayers' money, over to the private sector as possible. Now, that would be very similar, I would think, to having diagnostic clinics with MRIs to turn as much taxpayers' money over to the private sector. And I'm not saying that the government should be in the business of every aspect of roads in this province. I think construction of roads definitely should go to the private sector, tender that, and have the private sector build roads. But maintenance of roads should be in the public sector. In other words, the province should fund that department appropriately, keep it staffed appropriately, and maintain the roads through the public sector. And that's something that we haven't been doing. Now, when I think about the government's responsibility in terms of public health care, I think about one of my communities, which is Upper Rawdon. Upper Rawdon community had developed a community health board. They actually have a clinic in the basement of the church. They've been fundraising to try to build an actual building. They want a clinic that's a health clinic. They have a doctor, luckily. They've been fairly fortunate in that regard, and I'll give some credit to the previous Minister of Health for his efforts. But when I think about what this government has done in terms of bonuses, I think we raised the issue of up to $35,000 in bonuses to liquor store commission bureaucrats. Well, I would think $35,000 would go a long way to build a health clinic in Rawdon, and I'm sure those people would see it as definitely unfair that taxpayers' dollars would go to bonuses of that nature, and we can't be sure how many others when they're trying to build a health clinic. Now, Mr. Speaker, I only have about a minute left. And the point I want to impress upon the members opposite is that publicly funded health care is about all of us. It's about those close to us. It's about something that we all agree you cannot put a price on. You can hear that day in and day out. You could hear the honourable member from Chester St. Margaret's when his health was in jeopardy here in this House. The member for Cape Breton North the other day. I mean, we don't put a dollar value on people's health. So let's keep health care in the public sector. Let's fund it appropriately so that we know that those people close to us will always have that protection. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The time allotted for this particular resolution has expired. I now recognize the House Leader for the NDP caucus.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I call resolution number 2542.
Go get him, Shelley. Go get him, Shelley.
2542. I recognize the honourable member for Halifax Atlantic.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to this resolution. I brought this forward because there are so many constituents in my area of Halifax Atlantic and in other urban areas of this province particularly who are unable to care for themselves adequately, to afford decent, even safe rooming accommodations. As this resolution points out, many people are living in literally dangerous and life-threatening conditions in apartments which are rented to them, in apartments which bring revenue to their landlords. And it is the responsibility of the Government of Nova Scotia, as is recognized in so many areas of consumer protection law, to ensure that its citizens are at the very least safe. I have been approached by constituents, and I have occasionally run into constituents who are have been afraid to report their landlords for the kinds of conditions in which they are living. Some are living in apartments, particularly along the Herring Cove Road, but on some of the side streets as well. Apartments which at certain seasons of the year are up to an inch deep in water. The other seasons of the year see the walls covered in mold. Water, as you may also be aware, is something of a threat for exposed wiring, and I have at least once had the experience of speaking to a constituent fearful of reporting exposed wiring, who a week later was able to report that that exposed wiring had finally shorted and caused fire. There is damage consistently to the meager belongings of these people. There is also damage to the psyches of the people living here in these conditions. Recent news has brought home to us only too clearly the connection between marginalized living conditions and unsafe living conditions. At Mitchell Street and at Cogswell Street both, we have had tenants evicted from unsafe roofing houses, and we have had tenants who have lost their housing because the housing has finally been judged inadequate. What happens at that point? Why are these conditions allowed to reach this stage? We saw recently the introduction of a bill concerning regular inspection of amusement devices, fairgrounds, parks, merry-go-rounds, all sorts of other things which quite visibly jeopardize the lives of those who use them. Quite visibly, however, the lives of those who inhabit some of these apartments are jeopardized. And I should point out as well that these are not always only the marginalized who are subject to such things. Hurricane Juan showed us recently that it is sometimes not only the poor, but it can be the very wealthy, but disabled or elderly who are in effect trapped in their apartments. Hurricane Juan showed us people living above the 11th story in the city of Halifax, where water pressure from the Halifax Regional Water Commission is inadequate to climb by, it's not capillary action, but where the pressure provided by the Water Commission is not adequate to reach above the 11th floor. If you combine that situation with an elevator, which cannot be powered because there's no generator, and a person who is disabled or elderly and unable to come down, you have somebody who is not able to live in their own apartment. This is, of course, another end of the spectrum from those apartments which are consistently dangerous, hurricane or no hurricane. And I speak to this resolution because we require regular inspection of other devices which are responsible for people's lives and safety. They are amusement park rides. They are cars. And I think that we should be considering the very real potential for damage to life, health, and safety which arises from these very dangerous conditions allowed to perpetuate themselves. We've had debate recently over whether or not it was reasonable to talk about dangerous living conditions elsewhere in the province. And the fact of the matter is that cleanups are often believed to precede anticipated inspections or visits. What I am saying is that these inspections should be regular. And if cleanup precedes them, these inspections, great. And if these inspections are regular, great. That means that the conditions are maintained consistently, and it's not up to the tenant, who may be at a very, very disadvantaged situation, to report the problems. If these things have to be kept at a regular level of maintenance, then there is not any kind of an issue of people suddenly being evicted because the apartment has become unsafe. I feel that over time, what happens, it will happen, is what has happened with the inspection of motor vehicles and what I expect will happen with the regular inspection of amusement devices. That is to say that those conditions those items, commercially available items, whether they are apartments, cars, or merry-go-rounds, rides on merry-go-rounds, which are not sustainable, Yes, it's true, they leave the market. But on the other hand, who really wants to take a cut rate ride in a car with no brakes? Who really wants to take a cut rate apartment in which you pays your money and you takes your chances, but as long as it's not that much, maybe they shouldn't mind all that much. I don't think we're a society that wants to see people doing that. I don't think that we're a society that wants to live knowing that we expect people to pay the money and take their chances on things which are absolutely fundamental. We inspect restaurants for sanitation. Why don't we inspect living quarters? If there is commercial revenue coming from an apartment, then that revenue needs to be at least partially used for the maintenance of that apartment. It is not simply reasonable, it's not fair to use it as a gold mine on the backs of those who are afraid to report lest they lose what little provision they have. The government has a role to play in guaranteeing the physical safety of its citizens, and this is one important way in which I would request that the Conservative government of this province step up. Commercially available apartments on the market need to be regularly inspected. Do not place on the backs of those least able to accept the burden of policing their own safety. I hope, Mr. Speaker, that this will become an unquestioned element of Nova Scotia life. We cannot expect that these people who are quite justifiably in fear of losing the roofs over their heads should accept roofs that barely cover their heads, roofs that are full of holes. We don't expect it elsewhere, and as I say, we don't expect people to accept rides in taxis and cars that can't possibly pass a safety inspection. If we have a homelessness crisis, we have a homelessness crisis. We know we have it. And one element of that crisis is the fact that the states of these homes or these accommodations are suddenly known to be at crisis condition, and all of a sudden you have a torrent of people poured onto the street from inadequate, unsafe accommodations. If those accommodations are inadequate and unsafe at the time of inspection, why don't we make those inspections regular, mundane, and something that anyone gaining revenue expects to have to go through? Let's not flood the streets with people who are suddenly discovered to have had what was essentially not accommodation. Let's make sure that if it's sold as accommodation, it is accommodation. And that means shelter, a basic need and a basic guarantee of physical safety. This is something that we expect, and this is something that all of our citizens deserve to expect. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I recognize the Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Mr. Speaker, this resolution offers a solution that is totally out of proportion with the problem. The resolution would have you believe that most renters in Nova Scotia live in squalid and terrible conditions. That is simply not the case. There is an estimated 100,000 rental units in Nova Scotia. If I didn't know better, I would take it from the resolution that most of these units are straight out of a Charles Dickens novel, Mr. Speaker. Let's get the facts straight. The vast majority of rental units in Nova Scotia are in good shape and offer their tenants quality accommodations for their monthly rent. Of course, now, Mr. Speaker, there are some rental units that do not fit this description. Rather than lumping the good with the bad, the resolution should focus on a small minority of rental units that are not kept up to acceptable conditions. But the resolution doesn't do that. It assumes that all landlords are slum landlords and that all rental units are dangerous and subject to flooding and mold and electrical fires. The result is a proposed fix that is way out of whack with the problem, Mr. Speaker. Let's take a closer look at the many holes in the approach proposed by this resolution. First of all, there is no current central registry of rental units in the province. So to carry out the resolution, we would have to create this new central registry of residential rental units. Now, as I said earlier, there's an estimated 100,000 rental units in Nova Scotia. Creating a registry of 100,000 units would be a major undertaking. It would require substantial human resources and create undue red tape not only for landlords but for tenants too. Not to mention the cost to somebody, and I would assume the somebody would be the taxpayers of Nova Scotia. So who would carry out these 100,000 inspections each year, Mr. Speaker? I can only assume that it's the intention for that to be done by the government. Government doesn't have these inspectors at the moment, so what would we have to do? We'd have to go out and hire them, Mr. Speaker. I want to make the following assumptions, and I want you to bear with me as I do this. Let's say each inspector needs 2 hours for travel time each day and 1 hour for the required inspection. This would allow for 5 inspections per day. Now, this is assuming that somebody's going to be there to allow them in, because we know that tenants require 24-hour notice and that everybody can be in the same spot at the same time. And assuming that we gave those inspectors 3 weeks vacation and they worked 5 days a week, this would mean that they would have 346 days each to carry out their work. Using these simple assumptions, one inspector could do about 1,230 inspections each year. Now, in order to get all 100,000 rental units done each year, government would need to hire 82 qualified inspectors, Mr. Speaker. Assuming a salary and benefit cost, including travel and transportation, of $50,000 per employee, this resolution would add more than $4 million to the cost of government each year, Mr. Speaker. $4 million. Now, I heard the previous speaker say that an MRI machine is about $1.2 million. That means government will be spending enough money to buy 3 new MRI machines per year on this new program being proposed by the New Democratic Party. My belief is that Nova Scotians would sooner see us spend that money on something like MRIs, just like the member for East Hants said, Mr. Speaker, than spend it on this. I'm assuming the honourable member would say, we'll just pass that cost on to the landlords. Fair enough. Let's say we did that. And what would the landlords do, Mr. Speaker? Well, they would pass that cost on to the tenants. And then are we helping those people? Absolutely not, Mr. Speaker. We've created an entire new bureaucracy for the New Democratic Party to pass on that cost to the tenants who they propose to help. So we're not helping these people at all. In fact, what we're doing, Mr. Speaker, is we're adding an additional cost, an additional bureaucracy, an additional expense onto the taxpayers and the tenants of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. The people the resolution claims to help would actually be the ones who it hurts the most. I won't even go into the costs associated with training the inspectors, establishing a province-wide standard, test measuring for compliance with the standards, and the competency necessary for the evaluation of the premises against an established standard. I won't even talk about that, Mr. Speaker. In short, when you consider the financial costs and the red tape that would be created by this resolution, not to mention the fact the inconvenience to the tenants. All of those tenants who are living in very good accommodations would have to open their doors on an annual basis to have a government inspector come in and make sure their accommodation is safe, and regardless of whether or not there's a complaint or concern, they'd have to do that, Mr. Speaker, because that's what the NDP resolution proposes. Rather than take out a weapon of mass destruction to kill a fly, wouldn't it be better to apply protection we already have for tenants who might find themselves in these conditions? Allow me to read from Section 9 of the Residential Tenancy Act, and I think I've done this before in this House, Mr. Speaker. Section 9 says, "The landlord shall keep the premises in a good state of repair and fit for habitation during the tenancy, and shall comply with any statutory enactment or law respecting standards of health, safety, or housing." We have an act in this province that deals with that, Mr. Speaker, and we apply that act. In fact, as I said earlier in debate here in the legislature, we have several thousand complaints per year, Mr. Speaker. And as I said earlier, we resolve those complaints as they come forward. Each year, the residential tenancy program effectively deals with situations where landlords fail to comply with their Section 9 obligations to maintain the premises in a good state of repair, fit for human habitation. The program responds to complaints by tenants in the form of an application to the director. The complaint-based process allows resources to be directed where they're needed most. We apply the resources to where the problems are. We don't apply the resources to every single residential unit in the province because, frankly, the people who live in those aren't calling us saying they have a problem. The NDP want to fix everything all at once, and that's not the case. There's not a problem with every residential tenancy unit, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable member for raising the issue because it's another opportunity to explain how our staff, the staff at our department, the Residential Tenancy Act, are able to resolve thousands of disputes between landlords and tenants each year here in Nova Scotia. The Residential Tenancy Act exists to provide landlords and tenants with an effective, cost-efficient means to settle disputes, not the $4 million fix everything all at once approach that the NDP have. Frankly, I would expect that landlords and tenants would both be very concerned if a provincial government came forward with an initiative like this. Every year, staff answer over 50,000 inquiries from tenants. Both landlords and tenants contact the residential tenancy program to find out their rights and to help resolve their problems. When landlords and tenants can't find common ground, the Act provides for an effective dispute resolution process. Close to 5,000 disputes are brought to government each year. Of these, about 1,000 are mediated. This means that the parties are helped by our staff to find a solution that is acceptable to both sides. Not all 100,000 residential units have a problem, like we're hearing from the members opposite. Absolutely not the case, because if that were the case, we would have 100,000 complaints each year. If that were the case, we would have 100,000 of these things resolved each year, Mr. Speaker. Just 1,000 are resolved by our staff. That leaves about 3,000 that are settled by bringing the parties together through a hearing, collecting evidence, testimony, and issuing a decision on the matter, including, I would say, Mr. Speaker, including issues related to Section 9, which is clearly in the Act, that allows for and requires the landlord to keep their premise in a good state of repair, fit for human habitation during the tenancy, and shall comply with any statute, enactment, or law respecting the standards of health and safety in housing. That's something that's known by tenants. It should be known by members opposite, but obviously it's not, even though I've read this several times in the House, Mr. Speaker. I want to read it again. The background of this information is important because it's relevant to the resolution. The Residential Tenancy Act is already structured to allow for tenants' compensation when landlords do not meet their obligations to them. And as I said earlier in this House, that there is provision for that in the Act. In addition, Section 20 of the Residential Tenancy Act gives officials the power to protect tenants who may be victims of retaliation by landlords. And I want to take a moment to read Section 20 to the members here, Mr. Speaker. The director or the small claims court may refuse to exercise in favor of the landlord the powers of the authority under the Act, or may set aside a notice to quit if the director of the small claims court is of the opinion that the landlord has acted in retaliation for the...
Order, please. The time for the minister's dissertation has elapsed. The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it gives me great pleasure to speak on the resolution this evening. And the member for Halifax Atlantic, I would like to commend for bringing this resolution forward, but to start a program to improve the Act over a period of time, not to take it in its entirety. But I must comment on the minister. As the minister just said, it's not all that are living in these squalor conditions. But at the same time, that 10%, Mr. Speaker, that the minister refers to, that is the 10% that garners the attention, and we need to do something for those. Although 10% doesn't sound like much, it does amount to a lot of hardship for a lot of people. And also, Mr. Speaker, it's amazing in this day and age that there are landlords that are allowed to keep their buildings in deplorable condition, and some of them do that. And some of them seem to find a way to make that happen, Mr. Speaker, and it happens far too often for some residents. The name slum landlord rings a bell with a lot of people, and some of these landlords are rich beyond means. And I said in the last time I spoke on this, I wonder if those people would live in those same conditions. Some of them I would attest is close to being in conditions of squalor. Unfortunately, the tenants may are forced to live in substandard conditions, and I've had personal experience with some of these cases where people are living where the windows are tremendously drafty, single-pane windows that the weather seems to blow right through, doors that don't open or close properly, Mr. Speaker, roofs that leak, and basically a substandard housing. And in an ideal world, the Residential Tenancies Act would not be needed, but we have to deal with, I suppose, human nature as it is. And there's always those who the dollar is more important than human needs. Mr. Speaker, if there's people out there who wish to operate outside the law or vaguely within it, those are the people that I'd like to focus on. The House, I would say, should adopt this resolution, not in its entirety, but use it as a point of beginning to improve already on the Residential Tenancy Act. The Act is a good act. There's a lot of protection in there, but the problem exists when the experience I had the short time that I was there as a tenancy officer, you would get tenants who would come in who knew little or nothing about their rights. And on the other side of the coin, there was the odd landlord who might have fit that, but most of the time they would be facing a landlord who would be represented mainly not by himself, but would probably send a lawyer in to represent their needs, or a very well experienced manager of the residential properties that was in their care. And these people would be well versed in the rules and regulations of the Tenancy Act and would act accordingly, and it would leave the tenant kind of out in the cold. Mr. Speaker, I also think about, I was involved with barrier-free legislation, and I wonder, when it comes to people with disabilities, how much is that enforced in some of these tenancies, places that they have to live. I think there's an actual need for enforcement. I hear the minister mention the enforcement officers that they have, and I would like to see them be proactive, probably be authorized to make more personal visits to the properties unannounced. Drive down, drive by, walk in, take a look, see, with permission of the landlord or with permission of the tenant, or maybe they could be empowered to walk in and do the same as an auditor could go in unsuspectingly to do an audit on a business. Then the inspector could go in unannounced and just see for themselves firsthand the conditions that exist. So they could visit the properties, they could check on the landlords. They also, Mr. Speaker, what should be mentioned here, there are some and sometimes a lot of undesirable tenants who are functioning rather outside or just slightly within the law of and the rules and regulations of the Tenancy Act. But the officers could enforce the standards as they now exist and maybe bring back a report to the Honourable Minister that they could suggest improvements. Mr. Speaker, there has to be ways to bring about protection for the tenant, and the House could pass the resolution on to further discussion for amendments or adjustments, but I would really like to see it as a starting point for further discussion. And the member brought forth an issue which affects her constituents, but I'd like to make mention of the fact that it's also one that affects people who rent from one end of this province to the other. And the members of the House are limited in their powers, but we may be able to effect some change, as I said, and I'm being repetitive in using this as a beginning point. Tenants, like I said, are sometimes not aware, and landlords with lawyers, it creates intimidation for the tenant, and especially people with disabilities or a single parent with several children, where does that parent go? They talk to the landlord, they complain to the landlord, they could find themselves getting a notice to quit. How about seniors? I know of situations where seniors, Mr. Speaker, are intimidated in the homes for special care where they reside. They're afraid to complain simply because that for reprisal or maybe that some benefit that's coming to them, they may suffer the loss of it. And Mr. Speaker, I'm speaking about the need for improvement on both sides, on landlord's side and on tenant's side, because as you're well aware, there are always those who seem to be able to manipulate the system. Tenants and landlords, Mr. Speaker, I'll give an example. I'll give that happened in my own area. A young couple took their beautiful two-story home and used it as a mortgage tool to gain money to purchase an old farm, and which they did, moved into the old farmhouse, and proceeded to use the money that was garnered through the mortgage to improve the farmhouse, which is where they always wanted to live, along the Bador Lakes, overlooking the lakes in the old farmhouse, and maintaining the structure of that house and the architecture, improved it the way it was way back years ago when it was first built. They rented their home. Beautiful hardwood floors. They left it as they walked out of the house the way that they use it themselves. They left all the furniture, beautiful hardwood floors, everything painted, clean as could be. The person who moved in were well aware of the Tenancy Act. They knew what they could and couldn't do, went in and immediately decided never to pay the rent. After 2 or 3 months of excuses, these people were totally unaware of the rules and regulations and conditions regarded in the Tenancy Act, and they chose then to find out about it. They went in July and told the lady that they gave her a notice to quit. That was July, Mr. Speaker. The lady looked them in the eye and she said, "I'll leave in December." Well, they were kind of shocked. The hearing was held at the Tenancy Board. It was ruled in the favor of the landlord. The tenant was to leave within 30 days. Now we're into the 1st of August. The tenant then had 2 to 3 weeks to appealed, finally got a hearing around September. Again, that hearing ruled in favor of the landlord. The tenant then has the option to go and appeal to small claims court. The tenant did that. By the time they landed in court, it was nearing the end of September, so close to October, and guess what? By the time that ruling came about on the last time, they vacated in December. So, Mr. Speaker, what I'm saying is that there's good and bad on both sides, and there's always that small percentage who will take advantage. And, Mr. Speaker, I think that I would like to see the minister, when he was talking about what's going on with the Tenancy Act and how good it is, I think this should bring to his attention that there still needs to be room for improvement, and maybe a 5-year program could be implemented to improve it over a period of time without doing undue cost, and yet gently improve slowly over the years to get to where we want to be, Mr. Speaker. And with that, I will conclude my remarks, and thank you very much for allowing me the time to speak on that.
Thank you. I recognize the honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I take my time to speak on Resolution 2542, a resolution that, in fact, is extremely important to many Nova Scotian renters. Nova Scotian renters are people whom, in fact, find this as the only mode of providing shelter for themselves. And we do know that shelter is considered a basic human right, and I do believe that under the United Nations, there is a charter that deals specifically with the right to provide shelter to individuals. And I think that section is what's called underneath the section of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it's covered under that section of the United Nations to address this particular issue. And I want to tell you, Mr. Speaker, that when the member from Halifax Atlantic brought this resolution before this legislative assembly, it wasn't because she didn't attempt to take every other action possible provided to her. I want the honourable member who brought this resolution forward to know that I have stood in this legislative assembly since 1998. And in 1998, the then minister, who is now the member for Halifax Preston, brought forward a discussion paper on amendments to the Residential Tenancies Act. There were many, many stakeholders whom in fact participated in that discussion paper to the Residential Tenancies Act in 1998. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, the residential tenancies, for the first time I didn't realize, also covered mobile homes. And as a matter of fact, there were mobile homes that were residents whom in fact participated as stakeholders in that discussion. Not only were there in fact tenants involved in that discussion, there were also property owners. And I will tell you, Mr. Speaker, that in fact the discussion paper was supposed to have wrapped up, I believe, in November of 1998. Then there were going to be the recommendations that were forward were going to be brought forward to the Residential Tenancies Act for revision. That did not happen. We all know the turn of events in history. We all know that there was an election during a year-and-a-half period of time, actually only a year and 4 months during that period of time, in which a new government came to office. The then government that came to office, I then asked the minister, whom in fact was responsible for this Residential Tenancies Act at that time, the Honourable Minister of Finance. And the Honourable Minister of Finance was responsible for the section of the Act during that period of time. And he did indicate that yes, all this information was available. Yes, there was a need to review the Residential Tenancies Act. And yes, that it would come forward sometime soon. I asked that to the minister, and Hansard will record it, as well as budget estimates will record it, that I asked that to the minister in approximately the year 2000. And in 2001, during the spring setting of the budget, the minister did say that it would come forward. I asked the minister again, and he said the Residential Tenancies Act review would come forward again in the fall of 2002. Needless to say, none of that has happened. And as a result, we have witnessed many issues with respect to unsightly premises, facility shelters where people have to live in deplorable conditions. Yep. Such deplorable conditions, Mr. Speaker, that they have actually spoken out about it. It's been covered in the media, and it's been covered by everyone. Yep. As a matter of fact, it became such an important issue in the constituency that I represent, Mr. Speaker, that I asked the then executive director, the now present executive director, Mr. Gerald Hashey, responsible for the Residential Tenancies Act, to be the guest speaker at the District 9 Citizens Association meeting. Mr. Gerald Hashey, as a matter of fact, at the end of September, at the last Monday of September, attended the the District 9 Citizens Association meeting and discussed a whole host of issues to residents there at that particular time around residential tenancies. How to resolve the matter, much of what the minister had spoken here today were exactly almost to a T the same presentation that Gerald Hashey gave to the District 9 Citizens Association on the night he was there. The people were very pleased. Many of the residents in that area who rent were unaware of their rights within the Act. They also recommended that there be an advocacy organization to help guide them through some of the residential tenancies legislation so that they would have a better understanding of their particular rights. Mr. Speaker, there is no question, and I will be the first to admit that I represent a constituency where there is a high density of multi-unit residential developments. And there is no question, and I say this once again, that there are some excellent landlords. There's no question about that. There are landlords who maintain their properties and look after them quite well. And as the minister has said, there are 100,000 units in the province of Nova Scotia that have to be administered by the Residential Tenancies Act. What the minister also said is that there are 10,000 individuals whom, in fact, there are problems with, and residential units are available. And there are about, I shouldn't say 10,000, he said about 10%. I'm saying that equates to about 10,000. Right. And there are some 10,000 people in this province, and if you measure that out and consistent to a town or community, you know, if you were to put all these people who rent in units into a community and represent a community of some 8,000 to 10,000 people, it would be around the third, the fourth largest community in the province of Nova Scotia. That's what it would be like. And these are individuals who have absolutely no protection whatsoever, Mr. Speaker. These are the individuals who spend 50 to 60 and even 80% of their income for shelter. These are individuals who are on fixed income, who live in constant fear that if they squabble or squeal on the landlord or take to the landlord to the Residential Tenancies Board, that they're out on their feet. And they're out there no matter what time of the year it might be. They're out there in the wintertime. The Residential Tenancies Act has no specific time in when someone can be evicted with respect to seasons, can be evicted from their units. So in the dead of winter, people can certainly go. And I've known and had to deal with issues that should have been addressed by the residential tenancies legislation that had to be addressed because they were so bad, the conditions that people lived in, that they had to be dealt with by the then Board of Health. They're not dealt with now by a Board of Health. The people are left on their own, Minister. And you say the talk about, you know, what does it cost to provide a service for a person? And you talked about 82 inspectors being needed to address the issue of 100,000 inspection units, and that cost would be some $4 million. Well, I can tell you the government squanders at least $4 million annually. You know, I'm not prepared to say in bonuses or anything of that nature. I'm prepared to say if we went through the book with a fine-tooth comb, that we could come up with enough money to address a very basic human right of shelter. Absolutely. What is wrong with implementing, even if you can't implement it in whole and part? And when we as a political party bring resolutions to this legislative floor for debate, we're open and receptive to changes that the government may bring forward, positive changes. We do know that there needs to be a gradual phasing in, but we do not want the government to, out of hand, out of sight, just simply dismiss resolutions that come forward. I know the Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs and Service Nova Scotia has been in the community long enough and knows how serious the issue is in certain parts of Nova Scotia. He also knows the vacancy rate and the ratio in the Halifax metropolitan area. And he also knows, Mr. Speaker, that this has effect right across the province of Nova Scotia.
Order, please.
And that Honourable Minister, Mr. Speaker, should be aware that there are avenues to make progressive change.
Order, please. Thank you. The time allotted for Resolution 2542 has expired. I now recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, the House will meet tomorrow at the hour of 12 noon and sit until 8 p.m. The order of business will be public bills and private and local bills and private members' public bills for third reading. There will be some bills in second reading, and there will be some bills in the House for Committee of the Whole House on bills. So, Mr. Speaker, we should have a rather busy day. With that, I move that we now adjourn.
Motion is to adjourn for today's proceedings. All those in favor? Aye. Contrary minded? Motion is passed. Now we'll move into the late show adjournment debate. Was moved by the Honourable Minister of Community Services, also the member for Kings South. I recognize the Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and it certainly is a mixed pleasure to be up this evening, because something happened last week which I feel should not have happened in our fair province, and to the affected seniors that were so offended by this. Mr. Speaker, I'm referring to a resolution that was made in the House by somebody that is supposed to carry a good deal of responsibility in the governance of this province, that being the Leader of the Official Opposition. And Mr. Speaker, he got up in the House on that day and made some very disparaging remarks about the homes of some seniors that live in a public housing complex in Windsor. And Mr. Speaker, he was suggesting things in the House, and he got our attention. He got the members' attention. The Deputy Premier represents that area. He got my attention. I am the Minister. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, I would like to advise you that I personally visited this place and met with staff, went out of my way to meet some of the